We've often had the opportunity to participate in G7 summits. Sometimes we are called guests, at times we are called partners, but today we attended as a guest, which we welcome. We were able to participate with 4 other countries that are not G7 members, and together, collectively, I think we touched on important issues that affect not only the people of South Africa, but the people of our continent, Africa. We were unfortunately the only country from the African continent. We would have preferred that the African Union should have been invited, but be that as it may, we were here. 3 issues stand out for us. The first had to do with the pandemic, which is a key priority on our side as South Africa and as the continent as well. But bringing an end to the pandemic is our key priority. It's a key governmental priority as well. And we were rather pleased that this matter was thoroughly discussed here, particularly with regard to the participation of the G7 countries, that are countries in the north, most developed economic countries, where the tool that we have to use to fight the pandemic is manufactured, is devised, and yet on the African continent, we do not have the capability to manufacture this tool. So we brought a message here that we would like to have access to the vaccines as well, so that the people of Africa, whom only 2% have now been vaccinated as opposed to much higher percentages in the north, should also be vaccinated, that we should all have access and there should be equity when it comes to vaccines. And that the vaccine nationalism, because we are dealing with a global pandemic and an emergency, should actually come to an end. And to this end, we're pleased to say that the G7 countries have committed quite a lot of support and assistance in the form of making vaccines available and in some cases allowing exports to go to African countries and indeed other parts of the world. And they've also committed financial support through the COVAX and the ACT-A accelerator, where we are able to pool access to the various processes that we need to fight COVID-19. That having been done, we also raised the issue of giving capacity and capability to countries in the developing economies so that they too should be able to produce their own vaccines, so that it should not continue to be the preserve of the G7 countries. And we argued that as South Africa and India have proposed, we should waive the TRIPS process or measure at the WTO. And what we got here is a commitment that yes, the negotiations should ensue at the WTO. We're rather pleased with this, having amassed more than 100 countries as South Africa and India in support of our proposals. I think there's been progress in the form of enabling the negotiations to happen on the text that should be looked at by all countries. EU have made some proposals, and we have made proposals, and the text is now being negotiated. So that we see as tremendous progress. But at the same time, we've been able to get support on capacitating countries that should be able to start on the process of manufacturing vaccines in the form of finance, in the form of licensing. And so we think a great deal of progress has been made in that regard. So we're looking forward to the negotiations at the WTO. Second issue, of course, as a result of the pandemic, the economies of many countries, including South Africa, have been quite devastated. Economic growth has slumped in many of these countries, on the African continent and our own. And we've proposed that there should be economic assistance, and particularly looking at the IMF special drawing rights, which is a mechanism that can be utilized to shore up the finances of various countries. And we know that there's $650 billion that has been talked of and has been more or less agreed. And we also want access to that so that G7 countries and your more developed economies should do a mechanism that can be utilized to shore up the finances of various countries. And we know that there's $650 billion that has been talked of and has been more or less agreed. And we also want access to that so that your G7 countries and your more developed economies should donate the rights that they have and have them allocated to countries that do not have those rights. Now, there's talk of making $100 billion available. Initially, it was said to be $33 billion, and we've argued that it should be increased. We are still aiming for at least 25%, which could be in the range of $162 billion. With that, we believe that many economies would be able to have a measure of financial muscle as to be able to address the challenges that they face. The last one which stood out for us was the issue of the planet. Climate change is a challenge that affects many countries around the world, and in Africa, which is the least contributing to global gas emissions, suffers the most. We suffer from droughts, from floods, and from all manner of climate change effects. And we have insisted that there needs to be, we should not only focus on mitigation broadly and globally, we should also focus on how we differentiate from country to country, because not one size fits all. We should be able to find mechanisms that will lead to adaptation. We should also find mechanisms that will lead to financial support for a number of countries, particularly those countries that contribute the least. We all agree that yes, we should move to net zero, and we should reposition our economies to be less reliant on fossil fuels. That we agree to, and as South Africa, we have made a commitment that we will, yes, want to see a just transition as we migrate from fossil fuels, particularly coal, but we need financial support. And many countries in the developing economy world need some financial support. And this is where we called on the G7 countries to live up to the commitments that they have made in the past, to give financial support so that all of us can migrate in an orderly manner to move towards green economies in our various economies. So the summit for us has been in many ways beneficial, because we've been able to put across our messages, and we believe that the G7 countries have listened to us, and a number of areas are going to be addressed positively. And on climate change, as we move to COP26 in Glasgow, we believe that the calls that we have made will be heeded, and we should be able to see some progress emanating from that. Thank you very much. I see there are no questions, and I'm delighted.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will first take questions from the floor, then move on to take questions from members of the media who have joined us virtually. May I request the members of the media joining virtually to raise their hands, their virtual hands, when they want to ask a question. Kindly introduce yourself, indicate the media house you are representing. Also, kindly keep your questions short and to the point. If there's any member of the media on the floor who would like to raise a question, please indicate.
Good. Good.
It looks like there are no hands on the floor. Let's move on to the virtual platform. Anyone asking a question from the virtual platform? Diane Hawk, I see your gesture. You'd like to raise a question?
Yes, good afternoon. Diane Hawker here from Newsroom Africa. To President Cyril Ramaphosa, he has mentioned many times vaccine inequality. And I think good news from the global leaders there that they are intending to support. But is this pledge good enough and significant enough considering the pressures that African countries are facing, especially in terms of their economic situation, as well as the fact that India is experiencing so much trouble when it comes to actually making more vaccines, and they were meant to be one of the key suppliers for African countries.
May I take the second question?
Hello, President Ramaphosa. Hi, sorry. President Ramaphosa, obviously you tweeted last night that you had support from US President Joe Biden with regards to the TRIPS waiver. Are you disappointed that you haven't been able to come away from this summit with that agreed?
I think we will allow the President to respond to the two questions.
Is the support enough for economic growth or addressing the challenges that many countries face? And you cited, for instance, India, but it's not only India that is going through a rather horrid time with regard to tackling the pandemic. Many other countries are. I'd like to believe that obviously it could never be enough. We need much more support because the need is quite huge. So whatever support we can get, we would welcome. But what is important is that at this summit, they have realized, the G7 members have realized that support is needed for developing economies if we are indeed going to address the challenges that many of developing world countries need in the form of generating economic growth, but more particularly in addressing the pandemic. So that was prominent in their minds, and that is why we also addressed the special drawing rights issue, which can make finance available. But apart from that, there will be other forms of support through either the development funding institutions, through bilateral dealings between countries. And we see that as a recognition of the need for support to be given, because this pandemic has set many countries back. I can speak of our own country. I can also speak for a number of countries on the continent, on the African continent. They were on a growth trajectory, many of them, but the pandemic has set them back in many ways, and it will take years to go back to that growth path that they were already on. So there is need for support, because unless there is support, we all get mired in low growth, in negative growth, and that leads to all manner of problems and challenges. I mean, inequality becomes the order of the day, as it is at the moment, since the pandemic descended on the world, inequality and poverty have been exacerbated, and it has affected people of our continent, and I guess around the world as well, in many other social ways. Education, the health system have been challenged or devastated. So all these need support, and we believe that there is a need for solidarity to be pledged, that your G7 countries and indeed the G20 countries need to pledge solidarity with those that have been more negatively affected by the pandemic. Yes, our call, India's call, and South Africa's call for the waiver of TRIPS at the WTO has received enormous support from around the world, and including countries such as the United States, and we are grateful for that. What we have been able to get from, say, the European countries is the agreement that the World Trade Organization process must ensue, and there must be negotiations that are based on the text. And we'd like to believe that, having encountered negativity and opposition right at the beginning, the position has softened, it has become much more reasonable, and for them to have agreed that we should now have text-based negotiations, it represents a move which we would like to acknowledge. And when we do get to text-based negotiations, we believe that we can make headway. For instance, there's broad agreement that there should be a compulsory measure that can be used in country for, if you like, a waiver of the IP in country, and that is a general, I'm told, WTO rule. So there's been agreement that, yes, that can be utilized. But the problem is that it takes quite a long time to have in-country legislative provisions to allow that waiver to take place, to have compulsory measures being utilized to embark on utilizing the IP of or the patents of pharmaceutical companies. Now that in itself is an acknowledgement that we are dealing with a pandemic that requires emergency measures, and the compulsory tool is that emergency measure. And we are arguing that let us look how that can be implemented and how best we can look at how the in-country process can be either waived or changed. I'd like to believe that we're almost there. And I think the text-based negotiations are going to enhance an outcome that can be acceptable all around. And remember, these are negotiations. Negotiations are give and take, and we would like all parties, particularly the WTO, to approach the negotiations in a way which can lead to an outcome that will be broadly acceptable, but that will also secure the health of the people of the world. And we must focus on the goal. And if the goal is what we agree on, that we want to vaccinate the world, we must therefore make vaccines available. It's no use to have that as a slogan or a principle, and in the end we put barriers and blockages and prevent countries from having access to vaccines. And we are in a war situation against COVID, and we must therefore use every means we can to defeat this pandemic. And waiving the TRIPS provision is one of our best ways. We've always said that our best bet, all of us around the world, is to be vaccinated. And when we are vaccinated, then we will have a better defense. And we cannot vaccinate the North and leave the South, or the more developed economies and leave the less developed economies unvaccinated. So vaccination cannot be for one and leave others out. We are all safe or no one is safe from the pandemic. So that's what we would like them to live up to.
Mr. President, we have two more questions. Okay. One from the Business Day, Lucanio Mnyanda, the editor. After him, I'll read out one question from the SABC, Sophie Mugwena. Over to you, Lucanio.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. President. By coincidence, I also happened to be in the UK at the time, so I was looking how the local press is covering the event, and I was wondering if you are disappointed that it seems to be overshadowed by issues around Brexit and all of those things, as opposed to the issues that you've raised now in terms of vaccines. And then secondly, like back home, we've had some bad news regarding J&J, and I'm curious as to how this would impact on our plans forward in terms of like the plans we had for the winter in terms of vaccinating our most vulnerable people, and whether you've been in touch with President Biden or J&J about alternatives.
Thank you. I will then read out the question from Sophie Mukwena of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. She asks, or she starts with this statement, Mr. President, President Joe Biden said the G7 has agreed to assist in building infrastructure in developing countries. Is this not a way to push back China? And her second question, she would like to get your reaction. She says, President Ramaphosa, what is your reaction to the 15% imposed on multinational corporations? What is South Africa's view on that? Thank you, sir.
Well, I didn't get the first part of the Business Day editor. I just had the J&J issue. Did you get the question?
May I ask the question to be posed again?
Okay.
So let's start, Mr. President. I was just asking whether or not. I mentioned that I was also happened to be here in the UK, and I've been looking at the coverage of the local press. And I wondered if you are disappointed that it's been so dominated by internal issues like of Brexit and Northern Ireland, and not so much about these big meaty issues that you brought to the table in terms of vaccines.
No, I'm not disappointed. I guess the media has to deal with whatever issue that interests them, and if it is Brexit at the moment, they obviously must deal with it. And we have had a summit that has addressed the issues that are important to us, and I would like to take it that that too will be addressed in a number of ways. And the Prime Minister led this summit rather well, and he will obviously find ways of being able to communicate the message as effectively as possible, which I'd like to believe he has been doing right the summit and throughout the summit. So if there is one issue about Brexit that seems to be dominating the news today, I think it can be ameliorated by what he has been doing and what he will do post the summit as well. With regard to the question you asked about J&J, I mean, we've had some challenges in relation to J&J, which has also affected us in South Africa. With regard to the batches that seemed to have been contaminated, and our Aspen factory in South Africa had gone ahead to manufacture more than 2 million doses, which were supposed to be distributed, and they were ready to go on and manufacture others. So they were told to stop, which they did, and now in the end they are told that they are contaminated. So I'm told that they have to dispose of those that they have already manufactured. I spoke to the CEO of Aspen earlier, and he said, well, they are going to start all over again with another batch, and they should be able to gear up their manufacturing capacity. As you well know, we have stored a lot of our vaccination programs hope on J&J, Johnson & Johnson, because it's a one dose or one jab vaccine. So we've been waiting, but in the meantime, we've been using other vaccines, particularly Pfizer. And in my discussions with President Biden, we did say to him that we would like the doses that he's going to donate also to be channeled to Africa, also to be channeled to South Africa. And he agreed that he's going to do precisely that as soon as possible. So we should be able to get some doses from that end, and we will be able to get doses also from Europe. And we will then be able to have, as we have often said, a multi-vaccine doses type of situation. But J&J should be able to get up and going. The CEO of Aspen told me that by the middle of the week, they will be able to have started and manufactured quite a number of vaccines, which will be made available not only for South Africa, but also for the African continent. So we are hopeful that our vaccination program will receive a great boost as we get these vaccines. Coming to Sophie Mugwena's question on President Biden's statement that they are going to be investing in infrastructure on the African continent, that should be welcomed. It should be welcomed because we're a vast continent. We're a continent of many countries that have a great deficit when it comes to infrastructure. No single partner in the world can do it alone. So we want a multi-partner type of process in investing on our continent. And we are open for business, we are open for investment on the African continent, and we welcome those who will come with good terms, of course, and the commitment from the G7 to invest in our economies and to support our economies must not be looked at negatively. Actually, it is a very positive move, and we are actually urging the G7 countries who had slowed down with their investment processes on the African continent in the main, not completely, to start gearing up, to start increasing their foreign direct investment, and indeed their assistance programs on the African continent so that we can grow our economies. So we can never say that that is a threat to China or pushing China out. We are very inclusive in our approach. We don't see the exclusion of one at the expense of another. We see an inclusion, and that's what we are on the African continent, and that's what we would like to be accepted as. On the issue of taxation, the G7 countries have come up with a proposal which has been discussed and is still going to be discussed on a taxation mechanism which we have not had time to discuss, but it's what they have discussed, and clearly they see the taxation level that they've come up with, that at least it should be 15%, and I read that to mean that that's the floor and it can be higher than that, which I'm sure will fit their own economies. And taxation is very different in various countries around the world. Some tax as much as 70% and some tax as low as 15% or so. So that needs to be looked at. And us in developing economies, obviously, we've got to take a lot of things into consideration because the revenue challenge is quite huge. Our tax base is quite narrow. And in the G7 countries, the tax base is broad, both for personal income tax and for corporate tax. So in our case, there's a misalignment, and we therefore need to look at all that, and we must have the equation balancing properly. So it is a G7 determination, and we have heard, we have listened, and we were here also to watch some of these things. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the media, this concludes our business. At this stage, I'd like to thank the President of the Republic of South Africa for your time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the media.
Oh, these are live visuals coming through from a virtual briefing taking place with President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, at the conclusion of the G7 summit. Plenty of issues being discussed throughout the weekend. Some of the main highlights to come out of this media briefing today include President Cyril Ramaphosa highlighting the need to build capacity and capability for developing nations so that they are not at the mercy of G7 countries. This is in particular relation to vaccine production in the form of manufacturing and also licensing. Another issue that has come up includes TRIPS waiver proposals and the discussions surrounding IP of vaccines. He alluded to the harmonized standard global tax system, which is still under discussion. In a South African context, it does look like there are a lot more factors that need to be considered due to our unique context and climate. Obviously also alluding to the need for economic support and during the economic growth that has been slumped during the COVID-19 pandemic, seeking assistance from the richer nations. And last but not least, also touching on the issue of climate change, environmental issues and climate diplomacy, insisting that